There we go. Good morning, folks. My name is Courtney. I'm the education programmer with BC MPHA. Very excited to welcome you all in to this session this morning. We have a group of experts who are going to lead you through some chats on extreme heat and wildfire smoke, which we were speaking about just before we joined you all this morning, that it's very timely as the season seems to have begun. I will be here to help you with any tech things throughout the day. You do have the ability for during the question and answer period to unmute yourself, turn your camera on, ask any questions that you may have, or you can pop those in the chat. And our pal Dexter will be helping do that at the end of the session. Feel free to put questions though as they come up in the chat so you don't have to like remember them for the next hour or so that we are together. And we'll keep track of those for you. If you have any questions with Zoom, feel free to just frantically wave your arms, type something in the chat, and I will do my best to find you and help in any sort of way. Before we get started, I would also just like to acknowledge that BCMPHA and the rest of us, our offices and our work is located on the unceded traditional Coast Salish territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, but our work does take place throughout the ancestral lands and unceded territories of 198 distinct First Nation groups in BC. I myself am speaking to you from Sauk Nation on Vancouver Island, and it's always important for us to start off these sessions acknowledging territory in our efforts towards truth and reconciliation. And I will pass our over to our first speakers this morning. Thanks, folks.
Just getting our slide shared here. And it'll take 1 second while I pull this up. There we go. Hopefully this is visible and in presentation mode. If I see any thumbs up or down, that will be helpful from the group. I'm Michael Schwant. I'm a medical health officer at Vancouver Coastal Health, and I'll be presenting today with Megan Straight, my colleague who's an analyst with our Healthy Environments and Climate Change team. And I did want to just note my thanks to some other members of our team, Craig Brown, Iris Chan, Emily Peterson, and Tyler Semler, who have contributed some of the content to this, some of the thought that goes into these presentations. It's definitely a team effort. So Megan and I will be here talking with you today, but we really wanted to just show our appreciation for everybody who's been involved with that. Now, on to the next step. Really appreciate what was mentioned earlier. From a perspective of Vancouver Coastal Health, we just wanted to acknowledge that the land that we operate as a regional health authority is on the traditional unceded territories of 14 different First Nations. I'm presenting myself today from the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people here at our office near Vancouver General Hospital. And it's very important to keep in mind, we've seen in some cases disproportionate impacts of extreme heat or wildfire smoke on Indigenous populations, but also unique and very important strengths among Indigenous communities in responding to these hazards. And amidst the history of colonialism that has driven some of those risks and the reports of ongoing systemic racism in our systems, very important to carry a genuine commitment to reconciliation with us in all of the work we do on this topic. In terms of an outline, I'll talk a little bit about extreme heat and wildfire smoke as two key climate-related hazards and some of the health-related impacts of those things, and some of the specific risks for those issues, so specific populations and circumstances that can place people at greater risk. I'll hand things over to Megan that will talk specifically about planning and action to limit those risks around these two major hazards with attention to the context that our audience is working in, and then some specific resources from Vancouver Coastal Health or from other organizations that might be helpful. And then we look forward to the conversation through the rest of the session with our other presenters. Now, heat waves, this is a figure from the government of BC, from their climate preparedness and adaptation strategy, showing heat waves in the context of many other climate-related hazards. So we'll be focusing on heat waves and wildfire smoke that can relate to these hotter, drier summers we expect to see in a change in climate. We just wanted to note the context, we also expect to see potentially increased drought and water scarcity due to the hot, dry summers, impacts on traditional foods that could relate to those conditions, but also the importance of rising sea levels, warming oceans, and all of the effects that can have on ecosystems and the very physical nature of our communities. And then finally, warmer, wetter winters, which, as well as being a challenge for all of us navigating through rainstorms through the winter, can have very severe impacts. We've seen with the atmospheric river in the Fraser Valley in 2021 and other similar damage affecting infrastructure, affecting drinking water systems and our ecosystems more broadly. So just wanted to call attention to the broader issue of climate change and the importance of working on both climate change mitigation, limiting further climate change, and climate change adaptation, building our resilience as we're talking about today. Now, in terms of the impacts on our health, on the left-hand side of this slide, you'll see symptoms of heat exhaustion, and this is from a Vancouver Coastal Health and Fraser Health resource. And you'll see some of these symptoms here, some of the things that many of us might have experienced on very hot days. If we're outside doing work in the heat, if we're outside maybe even just enjoying recreation in the heat, some of these symptoms can creep up on us. So things like a skin rash, red, blotchy, sort of macular patches, as we call it medically, heavy sweating, even dizziness, and these other symptoms that are all listed there can be a part of a heat exhaustion constellation of symptoms. And it's very important when those symptoms occur, whether that's within a given person or somebody that you're working with as a client or patient, to move them to a cooler space, give them plenty of fluid to drink, and help to cool them off with a lot of actions that we'll describe later in the presentation. This can progress very quickly to more severe symptoms, so it's important to take action. Even though these things might be familiar symptoms that you've seen, they might seem normal in the course of a hot day. It's important to keep in mind that this can be part of a trajectory to more severe heat-related illness, particularly in people at higher risk. Now, what about heat stroke? On the right-hand side of this figure, you'll see things like an actual elevated body temperature. So when our bodies can no longer use the mechanisms that we rely on, sweating and radiating of heat, to cool off, and our body temperature, core temperature, also actually starts to increase. Decreased level of consciousness, being confused or even fainting, lack of coordination. All of these things, when we start to see those, especially those neurological symptoms affecting the brain, these are signs of heat stroke, which is a medical emergency. And we recommend that people seek medical attention promptly. That means it might mean phoning 911 if someone doesn't have transportation or quick access to medical attention, depending where they are geographically. So that's a distinction we like to draw, and these are some of the important symptoms to watch for. Now, how does that affect people in our community and in our health system? These are 4 graphs looking at the number of emergency room visits across our entire region, monitoring almost all of our ERs in the health region. In 2021, the summer of the BC heat dome, so you'll see this large spike, including almost 80 patients coming to our ERs in one day in the midst of the BC heat dome. And then normally in a given summer, and you look at the subsequent 3 years, you'll see these small perturbations, these increases in numbers of visits. We might see 5 or 10 heat-related visits in a given day, and usually less. And we think that this is due to, of course, not having the prolonged severe heat that we saw during the heat dome, but also really good measures that are going into place. We see increasing attention to this topic among the general public and among organizations that are working with people who might be at higher risk. And this is something that we're continuing to monitor very closely so that, one, our ambulance and ERs can be prepared and understand the potential impacts of extreme heat, but two, to understand how well our systems, both at the health authority level and among community-based organizations and other partners, municipal governments as well, are managing to prevent the sort of illness that leads people to need care for heat-related illness in the ER. Moving over to wildfire smoke, again, taking a similar format with this figure here, you'll see on the left side some typical symptoms of exposure to wildfire smoke. And again, unfortunately, more and more of us will have experienced this during the wildfire smoke exposures that we have across the province almost on a yearly basis now. So things like a sore throat, irritated eyes, runny nose or mild cough, all of those things, even some wheezing could be symptoms of exposure to wildfire smoke. Very important to listen to our bodies, listen to the folks that we're working with, move them to a space with cool and clean air where possible, potentially use air filtration or a respirator to help limit the exposure to wildfire smoke. So this is a sign that we're starting to have impacts on the body from that fine particulate matter in particular that can travel deep into the lungs and even cross into the bloodstream and cause very important impacts. Now, more severe symptoms that start to have more impact on the lungs and respiratory system, even impacts on the circulatory system. I'll name them here. Ongoing shortness of breath that doesn't resolve with rest, a more severe cough, experiencing dizziness, or even having chest pain or heart palpitations, signs of impacts on the heart and circulatory system. Again, very severe symptoms. And at these points, these could be symptoms of potentially exacerbations of obstructive pulmonary disease, heart attack, and related cardiac events. All very important to seek medical attention. So continuing to seek relief from the exposure, but also seeking medical attention because these could be quite damaging conditions. Listing those out a little bit more, we have a great review from Health Canada on these human health effects. Again, unfortunately, there's been more and more exposure, more and more learning about that we've seen as we see whether in Canada, the United States, Australia, and around the world, these events becoming more common and being tracked by our health systems. So naturally, we understand that these do have impacts on lung health. So exacerbations of asthma, even early onset of asthma among children and people who might be predisposed to that. Increased risk of other conditions, though, and that system-wide inflammatory impact that I described can increase our risk for stroke, heart attack, or death from a variety of causes. There's more and more knowledge on impacts to a pregnancy, to a developing fetus, and in early childhood. In addition to this, emerging evidence, and this has been described by many scientists working even in British Columbia at the BC Centre for Disease Control and our academic institutions, UBC and SFU as well, among others, looking at impacts on brain health. So potential risk for dementia over time, potential risk for a variety of cancers due to long-term exposure and other conditions. So as we see more and more long-term exposure to these, there's more and more population-based studies that are finding the wide variety of impacts beyond just our lungs and throat that are most immediately exposed. Looking at those key impacts, though, both of these graphs, the purple lines going across them are showing the daily particulate matter concentrations during a summer of 2020, where we did have some very bad wildfire exposure at the end of the year in Metro Vancouver. So this is particularly looking at fine particulate matter, that one that I mentioned can have a very severe impact. You see that spike there in late September of that year. Now, right along that time, those blue bars that are going across the graph showing the number of physician visits every day, with the number of asthma inhalers dispensed from pharmacies every single day, really spike. You'll see that increase, and the bars turn to orange because the scientists that put this together, the epidemiologists, statisticians, describe this as a rare count compared with the expected range. So instead of that week-to-week flux of seeing, 5 days a week, people going to their doctor for asthma-related visits, you see those little gaps on the weekend, and then a massive spike around the time of the wildfire. So this really does impact on people who are living with asthma or other risk, in particular people with other risk factors. Now, getting into some of the specific risk factors that I named, this is a long list of things that can put people at higher risk from heat. And I'll read the note at the very bottom there. Important to keep in mind that many of these can intersect. So we see some of these risk factors that might be described as more biomedical. So having, for example, pre-existing asthma or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, naturally enough, are going to put people at higher risk for some of the impacts that I've described. In the meantime, social or environmental risks, so where we live and the nature of our circumstances, can also increase risk. And many times those do intersect. And one of the biggest examples of that is right at the top. Older adults, defined in this case as people over 60 who've been at higher risk in BC, might be at greater risk biologically due to decreased ability of the body to cool off and some of the medical risks that come with age, but also due to things like social isolation, increased likelihood of living in an overheated space, and so forth. So it's important to keep all of these in mind. I won't read each and every one of these out. It'll take a little while, and all of this information will be circulated, but I would like to emphasize that isolation has really been highlighted as a key risk factor among all of these different medical risks, and as well as that mental health. And there's, again, that intersecting aspect. One new piece of data that came from BC CDC research around the heat dome was that schizophrenia was a massive risk factor for death and for illness during the BC heat dome. There's good knowledge on how diabetes, heart disease, lung disease have been risk factors for heat-related illness, but this finding in the BC context around schizophrenia is really informative for us in how we work with our populations to understand that intersection of mental health, potentially isolation, barriers to access, stigma, how all of those things come to bear. So these are just some key risk factors I wanted to name. Looking at the environmental level, this has been studied by the City of Vancouver, along with Vancouver Coastal Health and BC CDC. Some of this might be pretty intuitive. If you look at that building on the right, it's got a green roof, a lot of trees around it, smaller windows with awnings. Naturally, these are protective factors. Most of all, though, the real sort of the trump card for cooling, air conditioning or a heat pump by far. That's why it's got the biggest arrow there. It was found to be the most impactful in a survey of Vancouver residents, looking at the nature of their living space and the temperatures recorded in their house or apartment during a variety of 3 different heat seasons. Risk factors, having windows that take up more than half of the wall space, which is pretty common in a lot of Vancouver designs, windows that are facing south or west, so getting that daytime heat, the sun causing a literal greenhouse within the space. Being on the top floor can also be a risk factor for a hotter space as well. It's not just at the level of the building where we see environmental risk, but at the level of the neighborhood and across the city. This is a figure from the city of Vancouver describing the urban heat island effect. And you'll see here, this is just on a given hot summer day. Some areas, some of the parks, for example, you can look over in, I guess that's probably Shaughnessy right in the middle in blue, or part of Southwest Vancouver where the temperatures were relatively low. And you see several degrees warmer in areas in the east part of the downtown and in Southeast Vancouver. And these are temperatures taken basically through a flyover process. Pretty fascinating methodology from the city of Vancouver, really demonstrating in clear terms this urban heat island effect, the idea that not only are some units going to be hotter than others within a given building, but some neighborhoods are degrees hotter than others during a hot day. Sensitivities to wildfire smoke can be quite similar to those to heat. We do see that even more so than extreme heat, we see that infants, the developing fetus, young children, people who are pregnant can be at a lot of risk from wildfire smoke, as well as some of these pre-existing medical conditions I had named earlier as well. People who might be more exposed, it's important to keep in mind not just who might be more sensitive medically, but who might be more exposed to wildfire smoke. People living who are underhoused or experiencing homelessness can be at great risk because, one, plainly not having the access to indoor space, filtered clean air within the home, but two, due to the stigma, the challenges of accessing indoor spaces, whether that's commercial spaces, spaces operated by governmental organizations like community centers or others, that ability to seek refuge is severely limited, which is something that all of us can take action on in our organizations. So that risk factor of not having access to filtered, good mechanical ventilation, in short, a modern HVAC system, a ventilation system, is one of the major risk factors. Now, before I hand off to Megan, a lot of people have been asking, what's the forecast like in terms of heat and smoke for the summer? And I was talking to someone from Environment Canada who said, well, Dr. Schwant, we've had a pretty rainy spring, so that's good. It's not been as dry as it has been previously, so we think that lowers the risk. And I said, well, that's fantastic news. And I said, well, not so fast, because we've actually had a pretty warm early summer in May. We've started to see a lot of heat early on. I said, well, that sounds bad. They said, yeah, it's kind of hard to say at the end of the day. So it's at this point, we're not looking at the extremely ominous conditions of last year, but not really out of the woods either. So in short, I think that we're all doing the right thing here, being on this call, having these conversations and preparing for potential extreme heat and exposure to wildfire smoke. So there certainly seems to be the potential for that in 2025. Now with that, I'll hand over to my colleague, Megan.
Great, thanks, Michael. So now that we've talked a little bit about some of the health risks, what can we do about it? So what can we do to protect our tenants and residents in nonprofit housing? Next slide. Thanks, Michael. So this is our BC Heat Alert Response System. So these are the alerts that we're going to be keeping an eye out for over the summer season. There's 2 levels, heat warning and extreme heat emergency. Heat warnings are going to be more frequent, something that we expect to see 1 to 3 times a summer, whereas extreme heat emergencies are similar to that heat dome level. So potentially 20% more increase in people passing away compared to what we'd expect over a summer. So that's why we're quite concerned about that second level as well, and trying to take actions to support people if either of these levels of alert are declared. There's a BC Heat Alert Response System manual that goes along with this, and it has recommended actions that everyone across the province, whether you're a health system or a community organization or a local government, ways you can protect people during heat events. So that's something that might be worth checking out. And the map here on the left just shows that across the province, we've got 5 different heat alert regions. So temperatures to activate these Met thresholds are going to be different across the province. Next slide. Thanks, Michael. So this is the bottom of our heat poster. Michael showed you the top before. It's a helpful one if you've got it at the front desk in first aid kits with group leaders, for example, to reference. It goes through those symptoms of heat-related illness, but also key actions to cool people off and how to cool off a space. I won't go through all of these here, but the most important thing is that really it's those simple actions using water to cool someone off that are the most effective. So trying to wet their clothing, help them to, take a cool bath or shower, drinking lots of water, even if they're not thirsty, and then also trying to keep the space cool. And there can be some everyday actions for those, even just keeping windows and blinds closed throughout the day to block the sun and try to keep some of that cool overnight air inside. And I just also want to flag that I know fans are quite common here in BC. I've grown up here. We all like to use fans. They feel really cool when we use them, but evidence is showing that they don't effectively lower our core body temperature. So the key message here is that we want to use fans as a tool to maybe help cool off our space, but it shouldn't be used as the only way to cool someone off, especially if they're at higher risk from heat. The big one for me is keep an eye on that indoor temperature if you're using a fan, because that's really our trigger to be trying to go somewhere cooler if it's getting too hot, even if we've got a fan running. Next slide, thanks. So these are those high temperatures. So if you're working in housing, like I know all of you are, these are really the things that we're looking out for over the summer. We know that high indoor temperatures are the most dangerous part of heat waves, and these are the ones to look out for. So over 26 Celsius is where we're seeing risk of heat-related illness increasing, and over 31 degrees Celsius can be dangerous, especially for people who are at higher risk from heat. If you're using passive cooling measures, so you're trying to kind of close windows and blinds, just keep in mind it may only drop temperatures by a few degrees, so it may not be the make or break. So if your place is already getting up to 35 degrees, closing the blinds and windows may not make that difference, and it's important to try to go somewhere cooler. And just a note here that the Residential Tenancy Act was updated, so building owners and landlords can prohibit the use of air conditioning, but it may be determined to be unconscionable if it constitutes a health risk. So just something to keep in mind. Next slide, thanks. So these are the air quality warnings in the province. So they're issued by two different providers depending on where you are. If you're in Metro Vancouver, that's Metro Van. And if you're outside Metro Vancouver, it's BC Air Quality. Both of those service providers, their alerts are amplified through Environment and Climate Change Canada. So if you're subscribing to any of their alerts, like Hello Weather or WeatherCan app, those alerts will come through to you. And just a note, if you're outside of urban areas, full-scale government air quality monitoring stations may not be nearby. So what does that mean? If you're looking for more accurate local air quality information for your community, it might be better to check aqmap.ca. Next slide, thanks. So these are the key actions for wildfire smoke. The best way to protect your health is to try to find or make cleaner air. So either buying a portable HEPA air cleaner if that's possible. The BC Center for Disease Control has a great guide on what to look for in an effective air cleaner. If that's not possible, which we know it is for many folks that can't afford to buy one, you could make a DIY air cleaner, which evidence has shown can be very effective as well. And then Breathe, one of our colleagues, has fantastic resources on how to make one. The guide is shown here on the left. There's videos, shopping lists, how to run a workshop, lots of great things there. And if that's still not possible, the best thing to recommend for clients or for tenants is to try to go visit public spaces with air conditioning, because we know that those tend to also have cleaner indoor air. And just a note here that sometimes heat happens at the same time as wildfire smoke. Ideally, we're protecting from both. So we're finding both cooler and cleaner, so filtered indoor air. But if that's not possible, heat is the more immediate danger for most people and should be prioritized. Next slide. Thanks, Michael. As well, trying to limit outdoor activities when it's smoky out, especially being active outdoors. The faster we move, the more we're breathing, the more smoke we're breathing in at the same time. And if we're going outside, we might want to consider a mask. The most protection is from a well-fitted N95 mask or style like N95. The numbers are listed here. There's some protection from a cloth mask with 3 layers or medical masks, and unfortunately no protection if you're pulling your t-shirt up, if you're using a bandana, a scarf, things like that. Next slide, thanks. And just finally, we're going to go through some resources. I know there's a ton of resources out there. It can be overwhelming and you're all very busy. So we're just going to try to highlight some of the most up-to-date resources for you. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just going to highlight a few so you know you can come back to them. These are the key public heat resources we recommend. Most of these are translated. If you're interested about fans, like we've talked about, there's a whole facts guide here that's got answers to common questions around facts. There's also a guide here that's how to check on people during a heat event. So we know those indoor temperatures are so dangerous, but how do we actually check on someone? What do we do if they need help? That guide's really helpful. Next slide, thanks. These are the most important public wildfire smoke resources from our end, at least. It's got some of those DIY air cleaner guides. There's a postcard at the bottom here, how to check air quality. And then that poster, the smoke poster we showed throughout is translated as well. Next slide, thanks. If you're working with your clients when you're on the front line, these might be helpful depending on what clients you're working with. There's information for people with schizophrenia, people who use substances, older adults. We've got guides here for community care facilities, for child cares and schools, and there's also WorkSafe BC guides for both heat and wildfire smoke. Next slide, thanks. And then there's some operational resources. There's social media toolkits if you want to share information out to your clients and through social media platforms. There's how to run heat check-ins as an organization, information about outdoor gatherings, how to run a cooling space, how to run a cleaner airspace, and how to do some extra planning for all of this. And finally, there's a guide for people who are operating and managing buildings, just like yourselves. Next slide, thanks. And then these are just weather resources that we recommend from Environment and Climate Change Canada and that AQ map. Next slide, thanks. Thank you so much for your attention. I know that's a lot of information. All of this will be sent out afterwards, and all of our websites are listed here as well as our emails. Please reach out anytime. We're always happy to answer questions. Thanks so much.
And that's it from Vancouver Coastal Health. Maybe we'll send things back to Courtney, who's quarterbacking the whole affair, and pass it on to our next speaker.
Well, Courtney,
Oh, you're
Courtney,
muted, Courtney. That would make sense. I double mute myself so that I don't accidentally make backward sounds, and it always backfires. Thanks very much. We have next on our docket is Dwayne from Security and Emergency Services with BC Housing.
Yeah, thanks for that, Courtney. Thank you very much for that. My name is Dwayne Russell, and I'm the Manager of Security and Emergency Services with BC Housing. So bear with me as we introduce the slide. I think it is being shared, if I'm not mistaken. I'll just get a quick confirmation that we are able to share the screen, or everyone's seeing the screen okay? The presentation showing up? Cool. So my focus today is to basically break this down into 4 key areas. The focus being extreme heat, of course, is the main hazard, but we also appreciate that they don't happen in isolation. So bear with me if the conversation stretches just a little bit beyond that. And the presentation is going to cover, BC Housing and some of the areas of activity around extreme heat. We're going to be touching on just briefly some of the changes to how new buildings are actually built and developed. We're going to touch on some of the key elements of a good emergency response plan. And then obviously we're going to finish off with providing a few tools and resources for, yourselves across the sector. My goal for today's presentation is to essentially create awareness around the work that we're doing. Would love to create a forum for discussion. So at the tail end of this presentation, I think we've got a bit of scope for a bit of a Q&A session that's going to be spearheaded by Dexter, which is a colleague of ours. Obviously share the tools and resources so that we don't just talk about it, we share some goods that can help with the situation. And of course, we're going to provide our contact information. So if you don't feel comfortable talking, you can follow up with us shortly thereafter. I think when you look at this slide, the points speak for themselves, but to tell that story, I think BC Housing with the clientele and with the buildings across the province has been on our mind for a number of years. I think in 2021 was a bit of a wake-up call. And so one of our departments, which is called the Sustainability and Resilience Department, has done some excellent work in developing a corporate action plan. And that corporate action plan is obviously liaison with a number of folks across our organisation. So everyone from the construction sector, so development asset strategies through to operations. And what they've done is kind of provided a list of corporate objectives. And so what that focuses in on is increasing capacity within the non-profit sector, obviously building our own capacity within BC Housing to support that sector, reducing the risk of overheating in new buildings, so more geared towards preventative and mitigation measures. Then, of course, point 4 and 5, we can say that this is a good idea, but without that feedback and input from different stakeholders, we're not going to improve that delivery. So feedback is essential, and so that's why points 4 and 5 are on that list. So just sort of talking about some of those changes to the new building. So I think in January of 2023, BC Housing released Technical Bulletin number 3. So that basically gave industry a bit of a sense of how they needed to approach building and construction. I believe the slide deck is going to be shared thereafter, so I think these links will be live, and so you can dive a little bit deeper if you want to check this out. And then if you look over to the right-hand side of your screen, you'll notice that over and above the technical bulletins, we have a whole research element of our website. On the bottom of the screen, you can see the website, which will also include a link. And this just gives with pre-existing buildings a sense of different measures they can take to reduce the heat within their building. Over and above this, we can talk about it during the Q&A session, but our Sustainability and Resilience Department, along with our Developer Asset Strategies group, are working very closely with government to understand the future impacts of climate. And then obviously with budgets and funding, we're slowly developing a bit of a project outline as to how we're approaching some of the buildings with pre-existing issues. The slide in front of you is just one example of some of the work that we are doing. So this is obviously a photo that shows a building with coverings that prevent heat getting into the building and sort of having that impact that our health experts referred to a little bit earlier. And essentially this just really supports building code, making sure that no one living space exceeds 26 degrees Celsius, and it just sort of aligns with the provincial standards that we're trying to impart to mitigate the threat from extreme heat. Sort of gearing in a little bit more of an area that I'm comfortable talking in. And when you look at emergency management in BC, it's controlled by the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. So the sort of key areas that we're going to look at today is planning, mitigation, response to that disaster, the state of local emergency, and how it can sort of relate to evacuations and the provincial state of emergency. So obviously when we look at planning and mitigation, the way we see it is that local authorities and the government are responsible for planning. But that doesn't stop there. We see nonprofit partners and everyone else in that community equally responsible for participating in the planning process. When it comes to response to a disaster, though, how that translates is that it is the local authority that is going to be spearheading that response. And so what you'll find is, you're first and foremost a member of that community, and any immediate support would go to that community that's looking after that response. That segues into the state of local emergency. So when a hazard starts to produce impacts, a municipality will look to liaise with province. They will look for that decision making to support the declaration of an emergency. And if that does happen, it gives that local authority the ability to start leaning on evacuation alerts and evacuation orders. So obviously we're talking about extreme heat, but like I said at the beginning of this presentation, they don't always happen in isolation. Obviously leading up towards the summer, we know that's leading towards drought conditions, drier landscapes, vegetation that's prone to wildfires, and of course, they can happen at the same time. And so just because we're looking at extreme heat doesn't mean that we can't review this as well. And so for evacuation alerts and orders, just be prepared that obviously planning in advance and being able to liaise with that local authority, both during an extreme heat event, and if it goes to another event like a wildfire, it's absolutely essential. So an evacuation alert is essentially being on standby to evacuate, and an order is obviously being told to leave the area. We can talk about that in a little bit. And then leading on through to the provincial state of emergency, and I don't think it's anything new to folks on this call, but in recent years, we've seen an uptick in provincial declarations. So I think 2021 was the flooding in the Fraser Valley, 2023 with wildfires in the Okanagan. Before that was COVID in 2020. And so as we look towards this season, it's just understanding that we could be active in an extreme heat event, but you've got to be mindful of how it sort of works with the overall structure of emergency management and some of those things that can happen that would impact us as an organization and obviously yourselves as well. So some key elements of a response plan is to obviously know your hazards. So for extreme heat, when you're looking at that, it's things like understanding the impacts that could result from that hazard. When we look at this and we understand some of the vulnerabilities of our sector, we understand health concerns. That was covered by the health experts just prior. We understand that with heat comes a demand on electrical infrastructure. It doesn't take much to look across the world to see power outages that result from that. And so you've got to think, what happens if there is a power outage? As I also said, there's other neighboring hazards like wildfires that could happen in quick succession to that. So you've got to be very wary of that as well. So you've got to understand what it is that could happen. And typically what you want to develop a plan on is those things that you can't avoid. So some things you can treat ahead of time and some things you actually have to plan if they occur. So when you're developing a plan, and just a quick plug that we will share some templates with you later on in the session, but when you're making a plan, you want to include those things that you can't avoid. So you want to plan to find alternate space. You want to plan to potentially have to evacuate. And then obviously the last point on this is building a kit. So if you are challenged with this, with those circumstances, you want to make sure you've got those bare essentials to support your clients as they're going through that challenging scenario. Local authorities and the government will be there to support in that emergency, but the best thing you can do is take some independence and prepare as much as you can ahead of that disaster. So sort of segueing into some of the information that we've got available as BC Housing. So once again, full credit to our operations, communications, and our sustainability and resilience, as well as our research departments. We've created an excellent resource page for yourselves. So if you've found yourself stuck thinking about how do you proceed with this, you can sort of follow that link, head to that website, and this is all public information. And what you can find is that there's everything here from kind of resources that you can help put up as posters all the way through to templates to help you develop a plan. So not taking too much time here, please feel free to follow up with this link and explore this a little bit further. Slides just kind of give you that illustration of some of those resources. So these posters and leaflets have been used in previous years. The image on your left essentially allows you to document and prove that you've been to conduct a welfare visit. The poster on the right is available in 9 different languages. So that just helps as a resource to save you from having to produce it yourself. Posters and leaflets also include a bit of information around how to look after pets. Obviously, from a welfare standpoint, we acknowledge that they're a member of the family and we can't disregard that. So these posters give you some sense that they should be a focus as well. So when we look at preparedness of nonprofits, we ask ourselves, how can BC Housing support you? And so when we look at these key areas, we're asking for everyone to check your extreme heat and wildfire smoke inventory. We want you to identify items that need to be restocked. We want you to kind of reach out to your portfolio managers if you do need those resources. And then we want you to proceed to monitor heat alert updates from the Ministry of Health and partner bulletins as the season unfolds. And then when the heat alert is announced, if your region is facing supply shortages, you can use that email address to loop us in. So in every kind of emergency, we're a huge proponent of ensuring folks have enough independence to sustain that first few days or hours of impact. But we're also super supportive and we're looking to connect with folks in case they do need that support. Okay, so I'll keep that thread alive as I go through these next slides. As much as we have prepared for folks, we acknowledge and absolutely admire the work that the province is doing with Prepared BC. So I think it was shared by our health experts earlier. And so the images on your left, you can see that these are both electronic versions as well as hard copy versions that will be sent to your institution for free. They're available in multiple languages. And so it doesn't mean to say that it's going to cover everything 100% because everyone's got their own idiosyncrasies, but it's a really good step in giving a resource out to either tenants and or partners within your own community. And then off to your right, you can see that it doesn't just stop there. It expands out to pandemics, wildfires, pet emergency plans. And so it's just a quick plug to say, in the absence of anything else, there are free resources available through the province that we absolutely support. Before I forget, I think an emergency ready planner is also an image on there that I've included. And so that just goes to show that over and above these resource handouts, there's actually now sophisticated tools they are introducing where you can just answer a few questions, and when you finish those questions, it produces an emergency plan for your organization. So use what's available. It's a quick way to get there. So just sort of segueing into some cooling kit suggestions that we've found have been quite helpful. We've had some excellent feedback over the last couple of years. Don't need to sort of speak each one of these points, but it goes without saying. And perhaps a question for me, and maybe something that we could raise at the end, would be electrolytes. So I was curious, we have these 6 things, but I'd also look to maybe Megan or Mr. Schwab to sort of comment on how we could sort of produce maybe a real basic electrolyte formula that might be able to assist if it is getting low. And then sort of going back to BC Housing's responsibility, from a supplier standpoint, BC Housing does continue to support reasonable requests to keep spaces and common areas cool, and those include the points that you see there. What we're asking folks to do this season is to identify those items that they may be short on, and if you need additional funding, we're asking you to contact your portfolio managers. The other transparent thing I'd like to pass on is that funding for extreme heat from the province has been available, and this year it's a little bit different for us. So as BC Housing, we do have stock available at our central supply, but over the last number of years, we have issued air conditioners, air filters, a number of supplies across province. Last year, we didn't get as many requests. So it's just a quick note that just like yourselves from a resource standpoint, we also have limitations. And so if you do find you need something, please contact us as soon as you can, and we'll work to get those resources if we could. Otherwise, we'll give you an answer why we can't. Some points around clarification, and this is a bit more broader than just extreme heat. From our standpoint, we've worked with a number of societies, and over the past couple of years, we understand there have been some challenges. So there's 3 sort of points I want to talk about here. So from a risk assessment and planning standpoint, our stance is that you're first and foremost a member of your community. From risk assessments through to planning, it should be done in close conjunction with your local authority. We do encourage you to reach out to your local emergency planning coordinators to begin that discussion, to let them know that you exist, let them know what you are and how you might need help during an activated kind of declaration of an emergency of sorts. And that just primes them to know that you exist and that you might need help. Personally, what I've seen happen is that there's a lot of confusion in this space. They do say, go to BC Housing. They're the ones responsible. We will always be there to help facilitate questions and support during a disaster, but as per the Emergency Management Act, local authorities are responsible for that initial layer of response to everyone within their community, and we support that piece of legislation. Segueing into the evacuation and ESS, it does plug back into the first point. So local authorities are responsible for evacuating members of their community. So again, if you find that you are within a community and the geography is prone to wildfires, what we do encourage is that you reach out to your local authority and let them know of the possible evacuation support that you will require. Obviously with that goes hand in hand with emergency support services. So once you are evacuated, the responsible community is responsible for setting up a reception centre and providing those bare essentials for anyone within their community. How BC Housing will support during a disaster is if you are finding yourself meeting resistance from that local authority, what we would encourage is that you work with your portfolio managers. They will connect with us as an emergency team. And then as an emergency management team, we'll be working very closely with the ministries and government. So if there are those, it's a polite way to say it, if there are those barriers that you're encountering, we'll be there to kind of help alleviate and kind of remove those barriers and get you what you need as best we can. The third point is building damages. And so obviously extreme heat, it doesn't completely relate to the damages, but we're aware that this can always happen in an emergency. And this just ties back to ESS and saying if you are displaced from your primary residence, the local authority will work with you to give you that primary and initial support. Sometimes if the building is severely damaged and there's a large quantity of them, it can take a number of days, if not weeks, to recover. So there's a lot more variables to consider here, but BC Housing will be very active in working with both yourselves, the local community, and government to prioritise how we, use those resources to recover whatever residences and services that we can. So it's quite a broad stroke there. I know it's a lot of information to pass on, but 3 key points we thought are quite valuable for today's session. Just to close it out, a few resources there. So just goes back to some of that incredible work that our research, sustainability and resilience and ops teams and comms have been doing. It's another link to the Prepared BC emergency guides. It also provides a link to information on evacuation guidelines for members of the province, which we're all a part of. And then again, just please connect with your respective municipality for planning and response support before you need it. And if you do find yourself stuck in a situation, you can call us through your portfolio managers and we'll be there to help remove barriers wherever we can. So it's kind of closing out. I'll point it back over to the team here. But if you have any feedback, we're always looking for that. It helps guide us, helps us polish our approach a little bit better. So if you need to, you can send us an email at extremeheat@BC Housing, and we'll implement that feedback as quick as we can. So without further ado, I'll pass that back over to the folks, and thank you very much for your time.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dwayne. Next up, we have Tanya, and I will just share my screen as well.
Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, so the 2021 heat dome was, of course, we've dealt with heat in supportive housing and in our shelters and in assisting homeless people as well, accessing our health programming. And at that time as well, we were also assisting people in encampments. But the heat dome in 2021 was definitely something that was much more extreme than we dealt with before. And going back to Michael and Megan's presentation, all of the vulnerabilities, the health vulnerabilities, pretty much all of them that were listed are all people that we house in supportive housing and that we shelter in our shelters. And I'm sure that's true for, most other housing providers as well. Definitely, people who use substances, lots of mental health issues, schizophrenia for sure was a factor for our residents with those diagnoses. We did try to keep an extra eye on them. Sorry for the background noise. I have shared office. And so, yeah, anyways, next slide, Courtney. Sounds good. So yeah, obviously those multiple vulnerabilities, as well as still monitoring for overdoses, and with the complications of COVID, where people were now sometimes used to being more isolated, sticking to their own units, and structural deficits, around the way buildings are built and constructed, and especially our older buildings, and especially SROs, which are those smaller, tighter rooms, not a lot of airflow, shared bathrooms. And so we had to really pay particular attention, and we're regularly monitoring the heat within the buildings, and it was very noticeable in some SROs how hot those buildings got. Next slide. And because of the extremity of the situation, we had to mobilize very quickly. Luckily, we're already well versed at hitting the ground running, and we're already in kind of these concurrent crises that were already happening. And one of the other risks within any extreme heat is also just fires within buildings become more of a risk, and fires being started outside of buildings. They're just that much easier to spread. So things to be aware of. So we did immediately work with BC Housing and Vancouver Coastal Health. And we also had conversations with Fraser Health around what our response can look like and what equipment we can get to help, and what are the best ways to respond. And one of the things that we did internally, just based on other practices, is recognizing that we do have so many people with these, really quite severe vulnerabilities, people with COPD when there's smoke, but in the extreme heat, we definitely had people who didn't really know how to regulate their own body, couldn't really recognize when they were too hot. We also actually house a lot of seniors. We've had a lot of people that either have aged in place over the years in our buildings, or were coming in from encampments or other referral scenarios. And so there was a lot for our staff to keep track of. And so what we did was we implemented basically like a fire watch. So when your fire systems are down and your staff are doing regular walks through the hallways, we implemented that, and with lots more wellness checks, knocking on doors, checking on people, especially people that we knew to be particularly vulnerable. And that actually made a big difference. And part of it was also trying to get necessary equipment to people that were the most vulnerable. And we did let our residents and shelter guests know that we would be checking on them more, and it was because we care about them. And so we actually had pretty good response to that, which sometimes it can be annoying to have people check on you more, or be walking the halls more and checking on you. But we did find it to be effective, and so that's something that we continue to keep in place when we're expecting extreme heat scenarios. Next slide. So one of the things we worked with BC Housing around was making sure that we did have as many of the supplies that we needed as possible. And we did learn more about fans during that time as well, that it's good for getting airflow going. And it does make people feel more comfortable. So, a little less panicky, which helps. But we did really have to educate people on, that fan might be making you feel cooler, especially when you're going to sleep at night and putting it right next to you, but it's not actually cooling your body enough to get you out of danger. So we're still going to be checking on you. We're going to be maybe moving that fan a bit further away, opening the doors to get airflow. And the other thing, obviously water, we also did immediately stock up on those electrolytes. And when our staff would find people that, were looking dehydrated, encourage them to drink, encourage them to have either the electrolyte gels or the drinks. And we'd make it up in big batches. And one thing that we did notice when we were trying to get equipment such as air conditioners, that the stock of them was very limited. And so it was hard. We had to really prioritize certain rooms, certain units within buildings. Another challenge with SROs is that they typically do not have a lot of common area space. So in our other buildings that were more purpose-built, a little more modern, we were able to really quickly turn common area rooms into cooling rooms and into cooling centers within building. But the SROs are a big struggle that way. And with housing the way it is, it's not like we have a lot of empty rooms that we could use, but where we did utilize those and encourage people to access other resources. But of course, when you're dealing with supportive housing buildings, there's security issues. There's, you can't just have everyone, all running to the one building and filling it up. But we do find as well that that the population we serve, especially in the downtown east side, they don't tend to go very far afield, and they don't often feel comfortable accessing those other public spaces like community centers. They don't feel very welcome. They don't feel like they fit in. And for some people, honestly, it's just too far outside their comfort zone to get to. And there is also mobility issues for some people to get to those spaces. So wherever we could, we activated cooling centers within our buildings, and that really helped as well. But yeah, the limited access, even with, with major big stores or whatever, we would bring in proof that we were a nonprofit, describe what we were doing. They were like, okay, you can have 6 air conditioners. So extremely limited. Same with fans. Even with flats of water, we tried ordering and they just canceled the orders because they said it was too much. So we just had to go out and into shops and get as many flats of water as we could. So there's definitely some challenges there. We use the wet towels and freezers, all that kind of thing. Water bottles and freezers, just whatever we could. Yeah, but it was a challenge, and we expect those challenges. So we try to stay on top of when we get in contact with our property portfolio manager to start planning for funding for the purchase of these types of supplies. Next slide. And so obviously a big part of it is not just telling our folks, hey, we're going to be checking on you more, but really relying on the great posters that the health authorities and BC Housing put out about what the symptoms are, what things you can do, regularly keeping our staff, residents, and community members informed of what the situation is, best practice for dealing with it. And anytime that we're expecting any sort of extreme weather, whether it's cold or hot, a text blast goes out to all of our managers to be on top of it, be prepared, get ready for it, make sure that your staff are prepared to respond, because we're seeing this coming up. And it's certainly the same with heat, and that heat dome was really frightening. And so anytime we're expecting any sort of extreme heat, we're really trying to stay on top of it ahead of time so that it's not as much of a scramble. So keeping people informed is a really key piece of it. Next slide. So yeah, the results and planning for the future. The heat dome, I know, was just incredibly brutal, and a lot of lives were lost across our province. And I remember when it finally ended, it felt like a long time, that we did get a call from Coastal Health, and I remember the person saying, "I'm so sorry to ask you this, but how many people did you lose during the heat dome?" And very thankfully, I was able to say 0. And that's because those things like those extra wellness checks, our staff actually found people that were suffering from the heat and were able to get them to hospital, intervene where they could before other help arrived. And I do believe that that those interventions did save several people's lives within our buildings. So that keeps us extra motivated to be responding in similar fashion. And then anything else that we can learn, we try to always stay informed. Of course, with the smoke, that brings extra challenges. We have, again, with people's health issues, we have a lot of people who have other pre-existing lung conditions like COPD, and then trying to convince people to keep their windows shut while it's hot is a challenging thing. So again, trying to make sure people are well equipped as possible in their rooms. And we also have some residents and definitely staff trained, and we'll continue to train them on making the do-it-yourself air purifiers, which we found quite handy. And it's nice for residents to be able to do that themselves and feel empowered in doing that. So definitely recommend, if you haven't done that already, following up with those resources. And I think as far as planning for the future, I'm hoping that, in our sector and other related sectors, that we can recognize that climate change is not, a once in a while thing. We're going to have these issues. These things are right now, they're here to stay until things, hopefully change drastically in the future. But we need to recognize them as regular events now. Extreme weather in particular, these are not abnormal events anymore. So we need to really all be aware and hopefully find this vigilance moving forward, that that funding is properly in place to deal with these ongoing issues, especially for the vulnerable people we serve. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Mhm. Alrighty, I think we're moving on to our Q&A. Dexter.
Thanks so much, Courtney. Just want to give a big, before we go into the Q&A, just want to give a big shout out and thank you to all the presenters today. Really appreciate everyone and all the information they were able to provide so far. So yeah, opening up questions. I haven't gotten anything in the chat. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, raise your hand, however you'd like to bring them forward. Also open to comments in this group too. If you have comments for maybe how extreme heat was in previous areas for your areas, really appreciate Tanya kind of bringing forward how PHS handled the extreme heat dome. So if other areas want to maybe even talk about challenges or ideas or kind of considerations from your areas, we'd be happy to share that with the group here too. See Michael's hand is up. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, thanks. Just seeing some great questions and earlier on the issue of oral rehydration or electrolytes as part of rehydration. And it's really a really important point. And you'll see some good approaches to that from organizations from the World Health Organization to some provincial health authorities, local organizations that are describing that in their own cool kit resources, like Toward the Heart is one. And overall, I think that especially with some populations that can be at higher risk, normally we would say in most of the messaging that you'll see from the province to for a general population audience is that overall hydration with water and getting to a cool place is your first line of defense. Because really, if we're needing to replenish from large amounts of sweat loss, that's because we're having ongoing exposure to high heat. So getting to a cool place, using some of those steps that Megan described to cool off in whatever space we or our clients happen to be in, it's got to be the first line. But understanding that that's not always going to be possible, or not going to be able to do that as well as we might hope. So people who do have ongoing exposure to high heat, and people who aren't necessarily getting the nutrition that they need to replenish the electrolytes that normally we should be able to get through water and our normal diets, but people who aren't able to access food on a consistent basis, people who, due to symptoms of heat-related illness, paradoxically often limits our appetite and our drive to eat, as well. Mood, anxiety, mental health, drug use can also limit the drive to eat, can have impacts on appetite as well. So we can't necessarily rely on again, hydration and normal diet alone, as we would sometimes describe to some populations. So I think especially where there's going to be barriers to nourishment, recognizing that ongoing sweat loss, the electrolyte loss, in a long heat event, something like the BC heat dome, and adjusting to recommend not only water, but also an electrolyte beverage. And there's some good recipes, in short, that are out there, products like Pedialyte and Hydrolyte, but also recipes so that we can create those basically in the home or at an organizational level. And furthermore, a lot of people have given the feedback that it gets tiring and boring to be drinking vast amounts of water day after day when we're told drink 2 or 3 or 4 liters of water because it's 30 degrees out. It can be a bit of a slog. So having something that is a little bit more flavored, could be something like Gatorade or Powerade, cut with water a bit so it's not pure sugary sweetness, can be just helpful to kind of keep people moving, especially younger people, kids, to continue to get that level of hydration. So great questions there. We just moved a couple of resources into the chat. And it's a good note for us at Vancouver Coastal to try to see if we can incorporate that to our website and the other resources that we have, because it is a question that we hear.
Thanks for that, Michael. Does anyone else have any questions? Anything they want to bring forward to the group? Yeah, Tanya, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, particularly in the downtown east side, and I'm sure there's probably some other urban centers that deal with this, is the lack of green space that's so different from other areas of the city. Really has a huge impact on how our buildings do and how people do, and especially thinking about people who are without homes and are out on the hot concrete. That's definitely something that I'm advocating for on a regular basis, is to increase those green spaces in the neighborhood, and hopefully other neighborhoods can avoid that happening just by maintaining that vigilance around green space. It's so important.
Thanks for that, Tanya. just a note too, we have another presentation, I believe, with HSABC at some point in the future this year too, kind of looking at outreach and support for homeless and at-risk populations as well. So just wanted to flag that for the group, kind of a different focus for BC Housing, obviously our outreach versus kind of our nonprofit buildings, but I want to flag that we're kind of looking at the support for that as well. To continue in English. Thanks.
Tanya did actually stir something up for me. I know with some of our community engagement with folks living outside of urban areas, that's sometimes something that we hear as well with heat is that folks are thinking that it's more happening in cities, that there's lots of, like, there's definitely urban heat islands in cities, so that can increase heat, lack of green space. But we are seeing that and hearing from community members, even in some of our smaller communities. So for example, I was up the Sunshine Coast last year and hearing from a woman whose apartment got up to about 34 degrees in the last heat warning up there. So it is something that we try to flag that it can happen even outside of the cities, depending on the design of the neighborhood and the orientation of the building or the amount of windows. All of those sort of building and neighborhood design features can impact how hot a space is. So just really keeping an eye on those indoor temperatures and all the fantastic things Tanya's mentioned that their team's been doing. There's some great examples of how that's actually put into action.
Piggyback on that as well. Dwayne put a bunch of resources were put into the chat, sorry, by Courtney earlier when Dwayne was presenting. BC Housing does have a pretty fulsome resource page to just support kind of what nonprofits can be doing or supported tools to just make sure that you guys are informed on kind of direction or requirements as we get into these seasons, but lots of good resources there. So just encourage folks to go back through the chat and just make sure that you've gotten the links. They should be helpful as you get closer to the season and just need that reminder of what are the resources available and support required. I'm not seeing any more questions. I'm going to give it maybe 30 seconds more and then I'll pass it back over to Courtney.
Dexter, there was one comment in the chat there, just the second one up from Marine View Housing Society.
Oh, I missed that. Thanks, Tyler. Yeah, so Marine View says our clients have significant mental illness so regular cooling spaces don't work and our buildings don't have good public space to accommodate any ideas. Yeah, that sounds like a very specific and potentially complex thing to answer. Maybe I can pass that over to Michael Schwan. Michael, do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I had some thoughts, and it's possible, yeah, the speakers, even some of the folks on the call might have some further thoughts too, because I know you're working on this day to day. One of the things that we've found working with local governments on this issue is we've got a lot of the feedback and some of the contact we've had with people who are at higher risk for heat-related illness, letting us know that cooling sensors, kind of in their traditional configuration, which is candidly usually a gym with a bunch of rows of chairs in it, is not necessarily working for them in terms of it being a space that people want to go, they feel comfortable. People have reflected that they experience stigma when they go there, especially people who are experiencing homelessness or under housing, who might be a lot of belongings with them or not present in the same way as other clientele at some of the at the municipal community centers where these are often based. So really, we see lots of city and town governments working hard to create the lowest barrier spaces that they can, and thinking of the experiences of the people that are so that's one of the first things that we give in terms of ideas is ideas directed towards those who are operating some of these spaces to make sure that we decrease those barriers, as well as that creating some programming in the spaces. If people need to go there, potentially for hours at a time, day after day, to spend time, having some programming, anything from, TV showing some movies, cards, board games. There's a lot of good ideas out there, and it's usually going to be community members who know best what's going to be helpful to make these into inviting spaces. But space to store belongings, for example, and I think most importantly, that a low stigma anti-discrimination approach among the staff who are operating those spaces. And we've seen good support from that from, for example, City of Vancouver being quite reflective on how they run those spaces. But the other thing I would note is that not only those stand-up one-time emergency centers, but also creation of cool spaces within locations that people are already going to spend time. So places that people might access on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis anyway, that they're familiar with, they're comfortable with the staff, volunteers, and other people who are accessing those sites. in many cases where we've seen those organizations be able to stand up and say, you know, the waiting room or the activities that you might come for once a week normally or on a drop-in basis, that is, you know, a cooling space, not necessarily a capital cooling center in the way a city government is running one, but an available space and an option to come to and take your time and cool off. So that more distributed model of spaces that include spaces where people are already spending that time and have the trust, I think will be hopefully helpful for the situation that's described by the comment from Marine View there. So thanks for a really good question. A major issue that we need to keep working on to make sure that those spaces work well, because we know that not all home spaces are going to be able to provide that cool space as much as we try. And so those outside spaces of a variety of cases, almost a network of cooling areas rather than singular large cooling centers is what we might need.
Just to add to that too, thinking, you know, highlighting the challenge with the cooling space in particular, could still look at cooling kits as a support tool as well. So depending on, you know, how challenging the clients are with their mental illnesses, still providing things like, you know, those cooling towels and water to the clients, making sure they're prepared or have support as much as they can in their units is another thing. And again, on our resource page, we do offer recommendations for what can be included in a cooling kit. So just kind of considering what might work for your tenant population, just considering that there might be some things that might work, some that might not work, but ensuring that you're at least kind of looking at options that can be provided at home for those clients. Tanya, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to, thanks, Michael, for talking about people going to the spaces that they're already going to. And I think that's really key, whether it's within a building they're living in or other programs that they're accessing. That's really key, places where they're going to feel welcome and that connection is already there. And then I just wanted to offer as well for, because we run lots of buildings that do not have the common area space for us to have cooling within them. Another thing that we've done anywhere that we have any sort of courtyard space or even outside a front entranceway is to install really cheap and easy misting stations that kind of benefit the residents and sometimes the community at large. That's really, really helpful, and it's something that's quite easy to do. So any space you have where you can do that, that also helps.
Thanks for that, Tanya. Another question, this one I'd probably pass back to you as well, Michael. Another Michael post in the chat. Can it be possible that some folks can be at risk of overhydration, particularly for those with underlying conditions or young children and infants?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we do see this some of the time, the risk of hyponatremia, so low blood salt, basically from washing things out or diluting those electrolytes by drinking pure water. So water alone is an issue that we sometimes see with people who are, I won't say aggressively, but assertively trying to manage that risk of dehydration and maybe drinking pretty vast amounts of water. It's definitely is a challenge to drink that much water. It's not too common that we see that. The greater risk is definitely dehydration, but we do sometimes see, in short to the question, that electrolyte imbalance in the other direction that we have with drinking. And again, this is for drinking water alone without any added electrolytes. So if somebody is needing to drink a lot of fluid over the course of many, many hours or days, trying to avoid dehydration because they're in a space where they just cannot cool off, those would be cases where we'd recommend supplementing that with some electrolytes, some sugar, to make sure that we're not just washing out, in short, diluting our much needed electrolytes with very high amounts of water alone. So yeah, good question, and important for folks who might be drinking, again, very large amounts of water typically. And this can come, we've seen this in a few different contexts. Medically, it's described people who are working and are trying to get ahead of things by drinking a lot of water because they know they're going to be outdoors in the heat for many hours. Seen in the athletic context, sometimes people drinking a lot of water for the same reason, and also sometimes with mental health and drug use that people are consuming large amounts of water for a variety of different reasons. And it could be due to a number of different patterns that can be associated with mental health too. So that can be a risk that we want to keep in mind, and having an electrolyte based solution could be a helpful safeguard there.
So thanks for that, Michael.
I might just add as well, On the flip side, part of the reason why we mention trying to get folks to drink even if they're not thirsty is that we find within some populations, they're not as likely to drink enough water. So older adults, for example, as we age, sometimes that can impact our ability to recognize that we're getting dehydrated and to feel that we're thirsty. So trying to encourage folks to keep drinking in those situations, unless they're on medications where they've been told to limit hydration by their doctor, and that's a good one to check in with a healthcare provider ahead of the season. The other side of it too is that some people with mobility challenges understandably may avoid drinking because it's challenging to get to the bathroom. So just trying the best as you can to try to get them to still keep hydrating throughout those heat events, because we don't want to avoid dehydration.
Megan. If there's no more questions, I will pass it back to Courtney. And again, just a big thank you for everyone for jumping on, and another thank you for our speakers. Back to you, Courtney.
Awesome. Thanks, folks. Always learn a lot with this group and appreciative that it's my job. I can sit in all these. I popped a couple links into the chat as well, and we'll send us all out via email. So which we have because you've registered. So you'll get a recording, you'll get the slides, you'll get the eval link. We love thoughts and feedback, as well as links to other upcoming online learning events with us. So if you have any questions, feel free to send an email and I will make sure that they get out to the right people in this group. Otherwise, we will wrap it up and let you all go back to your very important, busy jobs.
So much,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye for now.